Welcome back. Well, Vladimir Putin's daughters have been targeted in a fresh wave of sanctions imposed by the US against Russia. The White House has also declared full blocking sanctions on Russia's largest public and private financial institutions. The US President, Joe Biden, directly linked the new measures to the killing of civilians in Kiev and the suburb of Bucha. Joining me live now is former White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. Thanks so much for your time. First of all, we're talking about this at a time where Joe Biden's overall approval ratings are at the lowest point of his presidency, but the American public seems to approve of his handling of Ukraine. Is that right?
It is, and it's a very unusual circumstance. By the way, thanks as always for having me. Good morning to you. It's very unusual here that ordinarily when we have an overseas engagement that goes well, and the American population approves of the way a president is handling the situation, that approval spills over into general sort of political support. We're not seeing that here at all. I don't know why. I don't know if it's specific to President Biden, if it's simply because other issues are so important. Inflation right now is driving a lot of the domestic political discussion, or if people still remember how poorly the administration handled Afghanistan. I don't know why it is, but it is unusual. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Most folks think that President Biden has done a halfway decent job, or at least they approve of the way he's handling the Ukraine crisis, but it is not filtering through to general political approval.
What do you make of Barack Obama being in Washington?
Yeah, it was unusual timing. The two gentlemen have always had a very complex relationship on the surface. Everyone says that they're best of friends and supportive and so forth. And various books have come out over the course of the last 4 or 5 years. Some of the things that President Obama may have said about President Biden are not the most sort of supportive and positive. It is unusual always for a president to welcome an ex-president into the White House. This is especially difficult when the ex-president's approval ratings are much higher than the current president's approval ratings. It's just, I guess that would be human nature, that's a difficult situation to manage. But they did have a nice event. It was a nice thing to do for President Obama, his very first visit back to the White House since he left in 2017. So it was a good event as someone who's been inside these events inside the White House. But I don't think it translates into broad support for President Biden. Did not get a lot of news coverage over the course of the last couple of days.
I mean, going back to the White House, it might give him a bit of PTSD. If you went back to the White House, Mick Mulvaney, would you have mixed feelings about it too?
Oh, it's funny you asked that. I actually walked by the place last week for the first time in 2 years. It was as close as I have been. I was walking down Pennsylvania Avenue. I'm like, I don't miss that at all, especially with what they're having to deal with right now. It's a difficult place to work, but it was good to see President Obama back in the place today. It was back to see him well received. He's always been well received by the press in this country, so it was a good event for them. But at the very best, it's a very short-term relief for the Biden administration, and tomorrow they'll have to go back to dealing with inflation and Ukraine.
The sanctions are being ratcheted up, as we've just discussed, but I think we're getting to a point where Vladimir Putin, I mean, he's hurting his own economy and his own people, but he's getting worse. The atrocities that have occurred in and around the city of Kiev is just, it's hard to believe. So where do you think we go now? We're talking of war crimes, but I mean, I cannot see a path for Vladimir Putin or these Russian generals to be brought to justice. And the US doesn't even recognise the International Criminal Court.
You make an excellent point, and it's overwhelmingly ignored here. Everyone likes to say, "Oh, he's a war criminal," and listen, you can only draw that conclusion by looking at the videos to see the atrocities that have been committed. You want to run out and say, Putin should be held responsible, but we only do that when we completely defeat the other side. We did it after World War II. We did it in Bosnia. If we completely defeat the aggressor and the one committing the atrocities, then yes, we usually haul them into court for war crimes. But this is probably going to be a negotiated settlement at the end of the day. And I cannot see Vladimir Putin agreeing as part of any settlement to say, oh, yes, I'd be happy to go down to the ICC. And your point about us not recognizing that is valid as well. So it's a very emotional situation. I get that. I don't blame the president for having an emotional response. but to sort of raise expectations that Vladimir Putin is going to see jail time because of this, I don't see that happening. And it's one of the things I think they've gotten off message a little bit because they will overpromise and underdeliver, and that's always dangerous in politics.
Vladimir Zelenskyy has been quite incredible in his strength, being the lion of democracy that he is being lauded for being. But I think he's also been quite reasonable, strategic, and in his requests of the West, if you like. We saw him address the Grammys, we saw him address the UN yesterday, and he suggested that, perhaps if Russia is going to keep on saying, well, these atrocities are being made up by actors in the Ukraine, perhaps the UN Security Council should kick Russia off that council, or if that can't be done under the Constitution, dissolve it altogether. Is that realistic?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I hadn't thought about kicking the Russians off of the UN Charter. I'm pretty sure you can't do that. That was the reason we have the permanent members. But your point about Zelenskyy is really well made. I've met him a couple of times, and I'll be candid with you. I was not that impressed. I wasn't disappointed with him. He just didn't stand out as one of the great leaders of the 21st century. It turns out that that's the role he's sort of playing right now in Ukraine, and that's to his credit. He did address the Grammys here very powerfully in English over the course of the last couple of days, which always resonates. It's always interesting to hear the person speak your language as opposed to listening to a translator. At the same time, he continues to push for a no-fly zone. I still think that's a bridge too far for the Americans and for our NATO allies. If there's anything that changes that, it would be more evidence of these atrocities. Americans, I don't think, would have been interested in going to war with Russia, which is essentially what a no-fly zone means, over the sovereignty of the Ukraine. But you add this component of massive war atrocities against civilians, and it might start to change the American public, the public opinion. So I think Zelenskyy is doing exactly what he should do as his leader. I think he's asking for something that's unreasonable right now, which is the no-fly zone, but he's doing the right job and continuing to pound that message. And who knows, things may change the more we learn about how Russia has misbehaved.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, isn't it? Because you do see an outpouring of sympathy and outrage from the American public, from the Australian public, and all across Europe, the Western world, really. But at the same time, I think people do recognise that same war is hurting them. Hurting them on the hip pocket. It's pushing up their cost of living. How is that story playing out in the US?
It's interesting to watch it. The Democrats actually had a hearing just today in Congress, and they called in all of the leading CEOs of the oil companies and the energy companies here in this country to accuse them of price manipulation, of gouging, of putting profits before people, profits before the environment, et cetera. I'm not sure that really sells. It's always a strange sort of dynamic to watch the left go to the oil companies and say, we need your help to get off of fossil fuels. And then when something goes wrong, you haul them into Congress and try to embarrass them in public. So that's a strange dynamic. I don't think people really care why why gasoline prices are very high. We're looking at about $4 a gallon for us right now, which is historically high. I don't think people care why. They just know that it is. And this is so often the case. I told President Trump this almost on a daily basis. Presidents get blamed for stuff they're not responsible for, and they get credit for stuff they're not responsible for. I think Joe Biden is responsible for part of the inflation in oil, but certainly not all of it, but he's getting blamed for all of it.
You're so right. Before I let you go, I spoke to Joe Hockey this week, and he has reminded me of the long-standing alliance between our two nations, but also the blips we've had along the way. Since he has no longer been ambassador, we've of course got this AUKUS alliance. We've had an announcement this week about hypersonic missiles. And with Obama being in the White House, it also reminds me that, he was the one that promised to pivot to Asia. But Joe Biden has kind of achieved that with AUKUS, hasn't he?
He has, and by the way, I do some work with the university's U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney. Yes. They had a 50th anniversary celebration for the ANZUS Treaty this week, which I thought was a wonderful way to sort of recognize that milestone. The pivot to Asia is great. I think we are making progress in that sense. We're continuing to build the relationships with both the Aussies and the Ukrainians. The AUKUS thing that we talked about 6 months ago is a major development. It's sort of fallen to the back pages now, as most big stories do, but it continues. The real work there continues. So I think the relationships continue to get stronger. The work with the Quad continues to get stronger. But let's be honest with each other. The attention right now is all in Europe because that's where the war is. So it will continue. The relationships are still good. They will continue to be good. But I don't think that draws attention away from where all the energy is needed right now, which is in Ukraine.
Mick Mulvaney, always good to talk to you. I mentioned at the top of our program that you were former White House Chief of Staff, but also US Studies Centre at University of Sydney. So we appreciate talking to you this morning.
Thanks, Laura.